Hello, everyone. I'm Ginny Lobel with Cello Health BioConsulting, which is the new name of our legacy company, Defined Health, and I welcome you to today's Insight Series webinar. Today's webinar, The Rock Just Below the Water, Market Access Risk and Early Stage Biotechs, will be moderated by our own Ed Saltzman, and our distinguished panelists include Roger Longman and Jeff Berkowitz from Real Endpoints and Dennis Purcell from Aisling Capital. For those of you who are not familiar with us, Cello Health BioConsulting, formerly Defined Health, is a Cello Health business. Cello Health is comprised of a group of subsidiary companies offering strategic commercial advisory services and valuation and risk mitigation strategies across the development spectrum, from preclinical through phase 4 life cycle management, repurposing, and reformulation, and pre, peri, and post-launch competitive analysis for life sciences companies globally. Our team at Cello Health BioConsulting is scientifically deep, and we assist clients globally with early development and risk mitigation strategies, including indication prioritization and sequencing for their compounds, platform technologies, and portfolios. As well, we conduct search and evaluation for portfolio expansion at all stages of development, and we provide independent and well-regarded forecasting in advance of investment and partnering events. Before we get started with today's discussion, I'd like to bring your attention to the following upcoming events we'll be participating in, with a special call out to the early bird discount for our 30th annual Cancer Progress Conference to be held in New York on May 7th and 8th, 2019. As well, we invite you to reach out to us if you'd like to meet our team during the upcoming event in San Francisco in January 2019. To learn more about our events and or about Cello Health BioConsulting and Cello Health, give us a call, send an email, or visit our website at cellohealthbioconsulting.com. Please note that an audio-visual and PDF versions of the slides from this event will be available on our website within the next few days, and you'll be notified when they're posted. Also, please send any questions you have during the webinar via the system in real time, and we'll try to get to them either during the discussions today or at the end of the session, or we'll respond to you directly post the event. Thank you, and please enjoy this edition of our Insight Series briefing. I will now turn the mic over to Ed Saltzman.
Hello, everyone, and thank you again for joining us, and thank you, Ginny. And I want to thank our collaborators at Real Endpoints, Jeff, who is in the room with us today, Roger Longman, who I believe is in Connecticut, and Dennis Purcell, who I believe is in New York, but who knows where he is. But we're all here virtually, and a couple of things to just say before we get started. First of all, I want to thank our entire team here that worked so hard on putting this content together. I particularly want to single out Rooney Don, who's a senior consultant with us and who is heading up our market access initiative, which is a very important initiative in Cello Health BioConsulting, previously known as Defined Health. So without further ado, we're going to get started. I want to just get you set the stage a little bit. And because we are mostly a virtual team today, we lack the ability to see most of each other, which means that, unfortunately, despite the marvels of this technology, there will be some delays. And since I can't visually shoot daggers at the panelists, my role as a moderator is a bit more challenging. We have tried to script some of these questions, but if you actually saying this to the participants, give your co-participants a chance to actually get in. That would be really, really good. So I'm gonna start by just setting the stage a little bit, and before I do that, I'm gonna turn this over in a minute to Roger. But just to say at a high level why we want to do this and why we've chosen to do this. Everybody who is listening out there knows that there are hundreds of reimbursement market access consultants and firms and experts. Many of them have appeared in the last several years. Many keep appearing, overnight. There is no doubt that this is now a very, very, very important issue in the biopharmaceutical and life sciences industry, but our particular focus today is how this affects early stage biotechs. So we were glad to see on the sign-up list a number of our friends from Big Pharma who are listening. We're glad you're out there. This is not necessarily for you. Okay, we hope you'll stay, and we want you to stay, and we'd like you to send in questions. But we are really speaking and preaching to the early stage biotech companies that, as Ginny noted before, constitute the bulk of our practice at Cello Health BioConsulting. So we're gonna start there and let you know that something which I believe is I'm going to make a provocative statement before I turn it over to Roger, and just say that market access risk is now a fundamental driver of valuation, even back to the earliest stages of biotech. Now, obviously, this varies across categories. Obviously, it varies across programs. It's a very big statement that I've just made, but I want to just hang it out there and let you think about it, and let you think about the one thing we want you to leave with today, which is that it's almost never too early to start thinking about market access. Everybody has a different definition of market access. If I thought of a definition, and this is an off-the-head sort of definition, and Roger and Jeff and Dennis may define it differently, but to me, it's access, getting your drug to the patient through the preponderance of stakeholders that are involved in that system that influence the access of that patient to the drug, commensurate with you getting a financial return that is attractive, net of discount and rebates. So that's an improvised definition for market access. And what we do know is that market access is now the fundamental headwind that is leading to suboptimal launches. With that, I'm going to turn over to Roger and let him talk about that just a little bit.
Actually, I'm going to ask Jeff.
Jeff. Okay. Well, both Roger and Jeff can speak about it, but
I'm glad we went to all that trouble putting everybody's names on each slide. I'll say that. But Ed, thanks to the Define Health team for including us in this. For me, it's very mission driven, because a lot of the things that you just said about the importance of market access, I've been saying for the better part of 2 decades, first within large pharma and then throughout drug distribution, and certainly on the payer side. And so these issues have been out there. We've been talking about them for a long time. It does feel a little bit different right now. It does feel like we're at an inflection point in time in the market that is driving these issues even more than they had been in the past from an importance perspective. And there are probably lots of issues we could talk about. The way we like to frame it on this slide is really to keep it simple and put it in 3 major buckets of what we would say are exponential changes that are really forcing biotechs to think about access in a more important way. Starting with first on the left, this whole issue of vertical and horizontal integration. We really are in an unprecedented period of time. One of the challenges we have with this slide is that these things are literally changing on a daily basis. I think as I was driving here, Express Scripts and Cigna had gotten approvals from New York and California on their merger, for example. So this stuff is changing in real time. But the macro trend is obviously this massive consolidation and vertical integration that's taking place. Certainly CVS being a retail pharmacy chain with a PBM, and Caremark now having purchased Aetna as a health plan and being very closely affiliated with Cardinal is one example of that. Cigna and Express Scripts. There are some other examples of combinations here that you see, but it's going to have vast implications on an access perspective, because at the end of the day, we're essentially going to have maybe 3 very large behemoths, the megs in the delivery of healthcare. You're going to have Optum and United, you're going to have Express Scripts and Cigna, and you're going to have CVS, Caremark, and Aetna again, you'll have some additional consolidation taking place. There's some other players, obviously, Walgreens, Humana, Anthem, and a couple of others that will come together. But what's happening is it's created these three large behemoths that are going to be responsible for the delivery of healthcare in many ways for close to 80% of the population. And from a pharmaceutical perspective, if you're not playing within that ecosystem of those three large players, and so you could argue maybe there are 4 or 5, you're really on the outside looking in. So it has a vast implication for how you partner, how you come to market, who you talk to, what your skill sets are. I think the other thing that's happening is that while all of this vertical and horizontal integration is taking place amongst all these other players in the healthcare ecosystem, pharma and biotech are still sitting out here, almost placing a blind eye to the rest of the consolidation and integration that's happening. So everybody else is talking and truly partnering, and pharma is still sort of saying that they're partnered, but still on the outside of that ecosystem. So that's the one bucket. The second bucket is obviously everything that's going on within the Trump administration and all of the dialogue that we continue to have around pricing and reimbursement and transparency of price. Certainly the work that Alex Azar is doing as the lead of HHS and that team, while they're throwing against the wall lots and lots of different options, from European benchmarking to shifting benefit designs from Medicare Part B to Medicare Part D, or removing the anti-kickback statute, the rebate safe harbor to the anti-kickback statute. Whichever one of those things are going to stick, there are going to continue to be a quick and vast evolution of things that will happen from a cost transparency perspective and from a government perspective. And then finally, this last bucket on the right, I really call the disruptors. And again, you could put other things in this bucket, but it's sort of a question of Amazon. Will they or won't they? The number one question I get always is, having especially come from Walgreens, is Amazon going to enter pharmacy, and will they disrupt, and how will they do it? And certainly you've got some of these new players like Civica that are so fed up with pharmaceutical manufacturers. They're saying, we're going to do this manufacturing ourselves. And then you certainly have new measurement entities as well. So it's sort of these three buckets of all of the integration that's taking place, all of the work that's going on in pricing and transparency, and then how that's all going to be disrupted. And as Ed really said at the beginning, this is all, what you see on the bottom here are just examples of, there are really interesting products that had really great science with the best of intentions that were believed to be meeting an unmet need, yet the launches were still suboptimal. And they still failed, not because it wasn't good science, not because there wasn't a perceived unmet need, not because patients didn't want access to those products, but because the companies didn't get the access strategies correct, whether it was, pricing, the relationships within this ecosystem, or even the patient journeys as well. So with that.
So what I'd like to do, and is to come back here and take a segue from Jeff saying they didn't get the access right. One of the things we'd like to establish from the very beginning is, in order to get the access right, you have to think about access. It has to be thought about very, very early. So in our practice, we spend a lot of time with these things called target product profiles. A target product profile is more or less, as you probably many of you know, an aspirational sit-on-a-page statement of the basic, sort of the elevator pitch of the product. What is it? What's its mechanism? What's its study design? What patients should it try to hit? What are the efficacy endpoints that will characterize it? And finally, is it safe? And what are the data in that regard? Over the course of my career, I have seen thousands of target product profiles. If we collectivize that across the experience set at our practice, we would have seen tens of thousands of target product profiles. It is only very recently, and only with some degree of pleading to the clients, do we hear at an early stage program at the beginning a box on this, a line on this target product profile that says access assumptions. The access assumptions might be might be the number of step edits that one's going to have to go through, okay? It might be issues as if the access is going to be limited to the labeled patient population with strict enforcement of that. It may be, there could be 7 different scenarios. I'm not going to detail all of them. Roger and Jeff and Dennis may want to contribute some of that point, but the point is not to actually populate that box. It's to say, put that box on there, put that line on there, and start thinking about this from a very early stage. Just like your clinical data, just like your efficacy data and your safety data, it will be almost entirely surprising. It's like any business plan. If you're going to still be referencing back to that business plan in a couple of years, it would be remarkable. Same thing with target product profiles, okay? They're what we are attempting to achieve in both a minimal way and in a maximal way, but that line has to start to be populated into these profiles. In terms of what should be in a target product profile, we can talk about that a little bit. I'm going to talk about that a little bit, and then I'm going to, and I mentioned that on the line, but I'm going to also let Roger and Jeff contribute. So, in fact, I mentioned a few of those already starting, so I sort of jumped this slide. But again, let Jeff and Roger in particular talk about this a little bit more from the payer's point of view.
Sure, Ed. So I think that any target product profile now has to really define unmet need, but not unmet need solely from a medical point of view, but from a payer's point of view. And that's a very different perspective. And one way of thinking about it is, if you are a payer, how many alternatives do you have that you can put in front of the subject drug? That is to say, that can be step edited, that the subject drug can be step edited through. We'll give you some examples of that kind of thing. A second issue might be how severe this indication is. And one way of thinking about severity is, where does that drug fall on this continuum from diseases that kill you to conditions that are so purely cosmetic? That's a spectrum, and payers pay attention to that. A third issue, and we'll also give you some examples here, is the kind of trials that a company does. Payers are increasingly interested in the structure of trials and which comparators are being used when they make their decisions. There are a variety of other things, and I'll just mention 2 others on this slide. One of them is, how easy is it to get to the metrics by which a payer will be able to define whether that drug works, and therefore whether a contract can be constructed around risk, around a so-called value-based agreement. That is a choice that can be made relatively early in development, and would be extremely helpful to know. And then finally, something that nobody early in development would ever think about, but what kind of patient assistance or hub programs are you going to be providing? How much, what bridge programs are going to be provided relative to competitors to make sure that patients can get early access to this drug before payers have actually made a policy decision about it? Now, the idea that R&D guys are going to, do something like that sounds kind of radical, but unless you're starting to think through your assumptions about what you're willing to spend for access and the kinds of activities you're willing to spend, and how you are weighing each of these against the other, unmet need, for example, versus patient assistance. The more unmet need you've got, probably the less necessity for patient assistance. The clearer your target product profile will be, the clearer your development program will be, and the more likely you will be to have access once the drug is launched.
Thanks, Roger.
So one of the things that I guess we could do is just give one example of a drug with a challenged launch that certainly from the innovation that the invention represents shouldn't have been that difficult, but was. And so if you look at Dupixent from Regeneron Sanofi, what you see is roughly half of that drug's discontinuation because of access challenges. Either the insurance companies themselves saying no, or the cost to the patient, the out-of-pocket cost to the patient being too high. And it's what we've done here on this slide is just shown you how we have quantified how we quantified before these drugs have launched, before this drug launched rather, the restrictiveness challenges. And what we do is we look at, what are the attributes of this drug that either will delay or increase restrictiveness from in terms of its the attributes from a government point of view, for example, whether it's a member of a restricted class, from the economic point of view, and from the clinical point of view. And what you can see is that Dupixent, this highly innovative drug, had some challenges. Its challenges were not that it wasn't innovative, but it was somewhere along that severity index that we talked about. It was the issue of the competition. How many other drugs are there for these conditions? Well, in fact, with it would have seemed like there was nothing for atopic dermatitis, but as it turns out, payers do force you to go through a bunch of generic, not particularly brilliant alternatives to this. When it launches for asthma, it's going to be challenged because there are a bunch of other drugs not with the same mechanism, but certainly drugs that this drug could be stepped through, including Nucala from GSK, which is sort of dominating this particular indication. And then when ICER came out with its review of Dupixent, it came out and said Dupixent is not going to be cost effective at the current price. Now, you can say what you will about ICER, but increasingly payers are paying attention to what it says and using ICER as a kind of club to restrict access. And indeed, on the first slide, Jeff noted, or there's a little image of CVS getting together with ICER to create a formulary which will be based on ICER-determined quality adjusted life year numbers, and say if a drug does not have a quality of less than $100,000, it doesn't get onto that CVS formulary. So with that, I will close, and we can then go into some questions.
Before we go into some questions, I just want to wrap up a point that I think we've all been making, and this will probably segue us really well into the questions. If you want to underscore a point or two that was just made by several people who've been speaking, one of them is that, and I think this is Roger, who said that of the suboptimal launches that we saw, the majority of those drugs are drugs that were not the drugs that everybody would have rolled their eyes around and said, oh, the payers are going to kill those drugs. They were fundamentally not 505(b)(2) drugs. They were not reformulation. They were not life cycle management plays. I want to make it clear that I think in the world right now, pretty much everybody knows that doesn't work anymore, or that has substantial market access challenges. Where we are coming from, and where I think it's important to sound the alarm, is that these drugs are the same drugs that I personally heard people say years ago sitting around conference rooms and in some cases sitting around boardrooms, that innovation will be its own reward. Innovation will be rewarded. If the drug is addressing a big enough unmet need, the system will find a way to pay for it, okay? But those conversations never actually considered this issue of access, okay? And the ability to get the drug to the patient, as Roger said, through a variety of other steps that are terribly important in influencing the commercial performance of the drug. So what we're trying to say on this slide, and I'm not sure how elegantly or inelegantly, is simply that what you see in green, okay, is typically where a lot of value has been generated, okay, recently as we've moved from value at the proof of concept stage to what was coined years ago, and I claim blame for it, proof of relevance that many years ago, where it moved back early in stage. But what's going on right now, okay, is that access is now going to become a more important value driver early in development. It's not simply in phase 3. It's not simply a matter of developing your evidence once you know your product is going to work. And most importantly, it's not developing your evidence to justify your price. That is going to be something very important to do, and that's something that companies have been doing for years and will continue to do. I want to make it clear that the focus of our discussion is considering access much earlier, anywhere from the very starting line to phase 1 into the early exploratory phase 2 studies. Before I start the discussion, and I'm going to start it right now, I just want to let everyone know, because I didn't say it before, and I'm not sure Ginny did, that we are able to take your questions. If you send them in, they'll be routed over to Ginny. She will read them, and I'll get one of the people here, probably someone better informed than I am, to respond to them. So I'm going to kick off the discussion here, letting you know who's here, and I'm going to direct this mostly to Roger and Jeff. And Roger already covered some of these things in terms of the concept of what should be in the target product profile. But let me broaden it a little bit and just ask, what are the most important things a company can do early in development? If you could only do 2 or 3 things early in development to drive your value and minimize the risk from a market access standpoint, what would it be? What would a couple of those things be? What is your thinking around that subject?
Yeah, so I think you touched on a couple of important things, and I think you and Roger have both said the same thing, is that I think there has been this shift or this flip on who identifies the unmet need in a marketplace. And I think, in particular, we've had years where the thought was if you found a biomarker, or if you were solving something for a rare and orphan disease, or what the pharma company believed was an unmet need, they would be able to go ahead, develop that product, and put it out into the market. And to your point, the system would figure out a way to get paid for it. But as I think Roger said, and hopefully that point didn't get lost in the discussion, was really today the unmet need is being defined by the payers. I think Dupixent is a great example. I recall being on that payer side when the CEO of that organization came in and really believed in what he was doing, and actually believed that he had priced it right, and believed he was meeting this unmet need with all the work that he had done. And the payer system ultimately decided that wasn't quite the case, and it certainly didn't have the value that he had said. So really, I think you laid it out earlier, which is, one of the main things you do is start early, but it's got to be beyond lip service. I think what I found in my time in pharma is that, there would always be a process within the R&D organization that said, well, look, we have a box here that says market access, and we've either, put some thoughts in there or spoke to them, but it really is lip service versus really deep work. And today, in 2018, one of the things that continues to surprise me is, number one, how surprising this conversation is that we're having, especially with biotech firms and heads of BD, that they're still inviting people with this point of view for the first time ever to have this dialogue, and that it really still is lip service versus having some kind of deep sort of thought process around how are we going to inform ourselves on what is happening in the marketplace, especially given the exponential rate of change that we're having. So I'd say one of the number one things that I would say is having it be beyond lip service and having a real process, not to be overly process oriented, but to actually get real input in there, whether it's understanding all the puts and takes of the market, where this product might fit in, how it's being reimbursed today, how your competitors are being reimbursed, but doing a deep set of work on that. The other thing I'd say, and I'll turn it over to Roger, is that we're seeing over and over again that you cannot leave the market access strategy to sort of even the traditional market access team at the director level or account manager level, or it's got to be owned by the top of the house. As we talked about the vertical and horizontal integration that's taking place and the size and scale of these organizations and the outsized impact they can have on a launch, to leave that discussion at a very tactical level between, sort of contracting people within that ecosystem and contracting people within the pharma company isn't enough today. The market access issues have to be owned and driven, and that market access mindset has to be driven by the CEO of these companies and understand it. We're seeing, especially on the biotech side, that is not what is happening. We hear over and over biotech CEOs saying, forget the payers. Still, again, to this day, think, no, my science is so incredible, we're way beyond a payer discussion.
Roger, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Jeff did a good job. I agree with him.
Okay. So, and Dennis, I am going to bring you in a minute because I would want you to, not that I think you can only represent the investor side, but I specifically want to, and I think it's very important talking to this largely early stage biotech audience to talk about how this is becoming an increasingly important factor in valuation. We're going to get to that. What I want to go to next is this question of when. Okay. I was listening to a pitch the other night for a company that had a novel disease-modifying and pain-relieving approach to osteoarthritis. It was a fascinating pitch. The science was frankly brilliant and very believable. But this was very, very early. Okay, this was not even treating mice very well at this point for osteoarthritis. So this was a very early program. And I somewhat surprised the entrepreneur by asking, have you considered your market access strategy yet? And he said, no, it's really early for that, isn't it? And I said, I don't think so. You've got something called osteoarthritis. You have a potentially transformational medicine. And what I heard you say was, it's going to save a lot of money, okay? But all I know is for a certain number of payers, and it's going to cost them a lot of money, and they are not going to recover those savings or see a path or a way to recover those savings. So in my opinion, and it was an opinion I expressed strongly, I said, as an investor, if I were an investor, I wouldn't invest unless you took command of that or told me you had retained somebody, retained some good advice, and were thinking through, at least at a high level, some of the market access things. So that was one situation, all right? That was a large market, major innovation. Thinking through that, are there situations where it's really too early? When is the optimal time for a biotech company to start thinking about this? I'll give that to both Jeff or Roger, and Dennis, happy for you to chime in as well.
So I may be a little bit of a contrarian on this, and I hope I'm not being overly controversial. I find this issue quite confusing in the VC world because I still, and Dennis may have better insight into this than me, but even speaking to the VC world, I still think that there is this belief that if you get in and out early enough, that if you ignore pricing and reimbursement challenges, everybody else will as well. You'll find the drug, you'll develop it to a certain point, and you don't even want to know. You want to turn a blind eye to all the other messy complications we're talking about because you're hoping that you're getting in and out before anybody even talks about that. I think that mindset is rapidly going away, and I think there is no too early anymore. And I would think that while the reality of it could potentially hurt evaluation, it could also demonstrably help evaluation if you get to the access issues really early and you know that you've got a differentiated value proposition as you just laid out in an osteoporosis drug that could save the system a lot of money depending on how you're thinking about it. And I'm also surprised at how even some of the most basic blocking and tackling isn't done by the very earliest stages to even know when they're presenting you something like that, how are the drugs in the market today reimbursed? What programs are reimbursing them? What payers are reimbursing them? What step edits are they facing? It's interesting to know that even that most basic blocking and tackling of what else is happening in the ecosystem is not even being done.
Right. Thank you. Roger or Dennis, did you want to add anything on that?
This is Dennis. I guess I'd just like to add, Ed positioned earlier on that access was becoming as important as the science. I think we're in this kind of bubble right now where Wall Street and valuations are kind of paying more for the science than they are for the access, the road to commercialization. And I think we're starting, as Jeff and Roger and Ed said, we're starting to see that change a little bit. Over the years, Wall Street did a halfway decent job of predicting sales on the order of 50 or 60% of drugs hit what Wall Street thought. In the last 3 or 4 years, only about 15% of drugs actually hit Wall Street estimates. So that this question of access and ultimately sales is now one that's becoming a lot more important. On the private side, we've gotten much better at digging into the science, and even over the last 5 to 10 years, how we do our due diligence is a lot better. I think what Jeff said about lip service is one that we're still trying to figure out. We know how to do scientific due diligence. We know we have a sense of what is innovative and what isn't innovative. I'm not so sure yet that we as a group, the venture group yet, knows how to diligence the access question well enough. And as Jeff was saying at the beginning, it seems like it's changing every day. And when you try to do net present values or whatever you want to do to figure out what a company is worth, you know, if ultimately the drug gets reimbursed at $2,000 and you had it in at $10,000, you've lost 80% of your net present value. So I think it's becoming more and more important. I think right now, particularly on the cancer space, we're seeing a lot of the science and the innovation of science still being rewarded, but I see the shift coming.
And thank you, Dennis. I want to reiterate, just underscore one thing that Dennis just said, which is that 15% of drugs are hitting Wall Street's expectations. Interestingly enough, those expectations are already lower. Okay, so the Wall Street analysts are reflecting anticipated difficulties in access. Those are already low expectations, and they're not hitting those expectations. So this is sort of the second wave of that, and I just wanted to underscore that. That's pretty important. I don't want to continue to sort of flog this theme, but you know, we talked about some suboptimal launches. I'm gonna broaden this and maybe bring in Roger and Jeff a little bit more, because I'm actually also at the same time looking at some of the questions that are coming in, and we may not answer your question directly, but you may, if you sent it, you may see it being blended in here. You know, we talked about the suboptimal launches. They're there. We could probably go back to that slide. Can I go back to that slide? It's actually just to look at that for a minute. You can do that from here. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, just a light on that for a couple of moments. You know, I'm familiar with most of those drugs on that list. And that list is just a selected list. It could have been longer. We want to discuss any of these in particular, and we don't have to. Just do any of these jump off the page as being launches that could have been different, and if access was considered more broadly or more of an issue early on. I'm gonna Roger, is it okay if I direct that question to you? I'm doing it because Jeff is telling me I must direct it to you. So.
Well, I guess that's because I'm the one that always is willing to be yelled at. So I guess one good one to look at would be Janssen's Tremfya, which is, I think, the first IL-23 in for inflammation. It's certainly a highly novel drug. It's certainly a drug that's been developed and commercialized by a very smart, very practiced company. It's a drug that falls within a larger portfolio of anti-inflammatories, including the very successful Stelara, and yet it had a big challenge with access. And what happened? Well, I guess just one thing that these guys did was when it was approved, it was really there was a kind of issue of trial structure and evidence, which allowed payers to restrict this drug. And one of the things was it was approved in a trial versus for I believe it was plaque psoriasis versus first placebo and then versus Humira. Well, obviously placebo is not standard of care, and indeed Humira wasn't standard of care by the time that drug launched. The standard of care was either Stelara or Cosentyx, but that's not what this drug was trialed against. And so there was an almost immediate excuse or an almost immediate rationale for payers to hold back. Now, I will also say that I think that Tremfya has done a smart thing, risky thing certainly, by going head-to-head against Cosentyx, which is probably the leader in that world, in that market right now, and achieving superiority, at least in the primary endpoint, not in the secondaries. And that will position Tremfya, I think, in a better place. But it's late. It was not what it did first. And, to use the old cliche, you never really get a chance to launch a drug a second time. So Tremfya would be a good example of that.
I think just to kick it up a couple of notches also, because this list wasn't meant to pick on anybody in particular. I think you just said, you could extend this list out. I think it's the macro issue is that, we continue to see launches challenged from market access issues. I also want to be clear that those market access issues can be somewhat broad. It's not necessarily a pricing issue or a contracting strategy issue. It can be a patient services issue. A lot of people aren't thinking about the consumer impact of actually getting the drug, which program, is it all going to be in Medicaid or Medicare Part D, and what is the impact at the retail pharmacy when a patient is actually getting the cost burden shifted to them? These are all part of a broader access continuum that is challenging all of these launches. So it's not just that idea of I've got to have a negotiation with this PBM to get on formulary through some kind of step edit or process. And so one of the things, again, in a macro issue, and particularly since you're very focused on the early stage biotech companies, that we find is that, the skill sets that people have within these companies are also not a match for the evolution of the industry today. And one of the things we see over and over again from a real endpoints perspective in these biotech companies is that they're bringing in market access skill sets in a really interesting way. They're going out to the big companies, the Mercks and Janssen's and Pfizer's of the world, and they're finding an account manager who called on CVS Caremark for years and negotiated with the PBM at a very large scale in a very, very traditional way that has a very good story to tell as being, I've been in market access for years. And then they're being brought into these really innovative, complicated biotech companies that need advice and support across the spectrum of market access issues that I just shared, not just negotiations with PBMs, and they're not necessarily the right skill set. So they're being brought in, they have a good story to tell. The biotech company doesn't know because they've got a CEO that says, oh no, I don't care about the payers, it's the science. And then they're matching that with a national account manager who did a very traditional negotiation with PBMs, and they're missing this entire sort of supply chain view of market access and connecting all the dots. And that's, I think also creating some of the access challenges that we're seeing because they're not getting a fully fledged, broadly thought out strategy.
Thanks, Jeff. One of the things that's amusing me as I'm listening to Jeff speak is I'm also looking and multitasking and looking at some of the questions that are coming in, and hence anybody thinks we were being a little bit too mean about including these drugs on the suboptimal launches. A number of questions are coming in, adding many drugs to the and they just keep coming in and saying, what about this one, about this one? So let me turn the tables, okay? And I don't know if this is for Roger or Jeff or maybe it's for Dennis, it's for a company that you've invested in that you're enormously happy with. But are there any examples of companies you can discuss that actually maybe have gotten this right? Is there something we can learn? It's awful depressing. It's very effective, but it can be awful depressing to learn from failure. It can also be a little bit more rewarding to learn by emulating success. And maybe even imitating it. Anyway, Jeff, you have some ideas there in terms of something that
we talked about this because I think it's important. We're challenging ourselves to come up with the successful side versus being so cynical. So Roger actually had a great I think he wanted to share.
Sure. Roger? I mean, we can. Yeah. I think we can think about several. People have beaten up Gilead as a company for missing the market access challenges. But in one sense, I think Gilead has been extremely successful in the HIV space with market access. And its most recent launch with Biktarvy has been kind of an example of this. And what they have done very well is, if you think about this drug, it's not dramatically more efficacious than its competitors, including Gilead's own Genvoya. It's got some, I guess, some adherence advantages maybe. But what it's been able to do is to build up, and this is really a market access strategy. It has really been able to build up a patient and physician level of involvement that has made it very, very difficult for payers to say no. Now, admittedly, they have an advantage in that HIV is in a protected class, so it's more difficult for payers to restrict this. But as Jeff pointed out early on, the government is increasingly interested in changing the rules around protected classes to make these situations more competitive and allowing more step edits and prior authorizations in here. So that's been a really interesting positive example. Another one might be the opposite of Tremfya, which is Cosentyx. And what they did, again, was exactly what Tremfya did not do. They decided to prove their superiority, not to Humira, but to Stelara, which was the Janssen drug, was doing very well, and had become standard of care. And they did that. That was interesting. Now, I will also say that their competitor, Taltz, which from Lilly, same indication, also did rather well. I can't say it's been a spectacular success, but certainly much better than I think you would have expected, looking at it from a fairly from our somewhat jaundiced point of view. But they've done very well, largely because what they did, to Jeff's point, was they did a brilliant job of hub and patient support services. They did a great job of allowing patients to get on that drug so they could start them, and then they would slowly get reimbursed. It was really a very impressive program that they created. So there are three examples of how people did things in different ways to get market access. And all to Jeff's point, that market access is not a thing. It isn't pricing, isn't necessarily just discounting. It's a whole variety of activities that one has to use and to coordinate.
And this is Dennis. I'd be curious what your guys' opinion is. Another one I was thinking about was ibrutinib, which actually had a very selective distribution strategy, and the PBMs were forced to kind of uptake the drug. I don't know if you want to, any merit in spending a minute on that rollout.
Roger, any answer?
Well, I think that part of the difficulty there, Dennis, is that cancer is still a special indication, and it's very difficult for payers right now to restrict the use of oncologics. That is going to be changing, and I guess what I'd like to do is to flip that to Jeff to talk about, in fact, the changes in cancer, which is no longer the safe, which will no longer be for the indefinite future, the safe space it is today. Jeff, do you want to take that?
I think two things. I think, again, not to scare people, but I think oncology is sort of the next frontier, right, of this issue of access and control. It continues to be, with ibrutinib as an example, not the Wild West, but a lot of flexibility there. But as we continue to enter into what really has become a bifurcated world here, where you've got 85% or so generic penetration of deeply commoditized products at an extremely low cost that are being purchased across the world by three procurement groups on behalf of all these large behemoths. And then you've got this 15 to 20% specialty drugs. So all of these integrated entities are just going to continue to ratchet down and ratchet down and ratchet down on specialty. Oncology, I think, is going to be the next frontier of that. And so I think there's still this view that, if you invest in oncology, that it's all going to be reimbursed. But I think to Roger's point, the day of reckoning is coming. It will start being treated in very similar ways as the other controls we've seen. The only other point I wanted to make, just going back to some of Roger's thoughts on some of the success stories, one of the other things I'd say with Cosentyx in particular was that they really had a degree of flexibility in terms of evolving their strategy over time. So as they saw that they were having challenges with the market access, the patient services, and the patient impact and journey on that end of the market access spectrum, they were very willing to be flexible and keep looking at those programs and evolving them to make sure that they were either best in class or matching what the competitors were doing, and making sure they understood what the stakeholders, both patients, office managers, physicians, thought about those programs and how to continue to tweak them to make them better. So there was this willingness to not just put something out there and have it be static as they watch the market unfold, but a willingness to evolve their strategy over time to move in the right direction and continue the success of that product.
So Jeff, I'm just going to follow on that because I'm going to jump a little out of order on the structured questions, because we did have a question specifically around oncology. So I'm just going to be the sort of part B of the response, and Roger and Dennis, feel free to jump in. We have seen this coming. We did a webinar probably somewhere around 5 or 6 months ago around this whole theme about what's going on with competition, particularly intra-class competition within oncology, with all the checkpoint inhibitors, all the PD-1s, all the PARP inhibitors, all the various different, how crowded these pipelines are with relatively thinly differentiated products. But is there something unique to oncology, or are unique challenges that developers of oncology therapies are going to face in the next several years with regards to market access, or are they they're just coming behind and they're going to be pulled onto the boat?
I think it's a combination. I think one of the issues is you've got so much noise out there in each of these areas, and so many people racing towards the same things, which is why they're going to be pulled on the boat. I'm on the board of Infinity Pharmaceuticals, an immuno-oncology company that's looking at very similar things, and this is the very real challenge. There are just so many immuno-oncology companies. Everybody's sort of racing towards similar things or figuring out how to partner, or will there be doubles and triplets and quadruplets? And again, the question that nobody's thinking about is, how are those going to be paid for? What are going to be the structures in these areas? And I think people are still going after the space broadly without thinking of those market access issues. Where on the payer side, I think one of the things we don't realize, we think it's quite static from a payer perspective. The very same conversations we're having around market access and price and classes and things like that are taking place within the payer, community, right? So they have financial plans like everybody else, and they're looking out at pipelines, they're looking out at issues, they're looking out at solutions years out and coming up with their own budgets and budget constraints. And they're saying, what are the big areas that are set to explode that are going to impact me moving forward? Give another example would be NASH. Everybody's going after this space, and there's going to be, what I would say is maybe a NASH smackdown at a certain point. And the payers are going to respond accordingly. I saw PCSK9s, pop up on the screen as one of the ones that we didn't touch. And I think I think the reason I don't specifically call that anymore is because it's become the poster child. So that conversation's been had repeatedly, but it's another example. I think NASH could very much be in the same, predicament that PCSK9s were.
Jeff, you've just named our next webinar. It's going to be called Nash Smackdown. We'll wait for details to come. So let me give this to Dennis for a minute, if I could, specifically. So thinking about some of these things we've been talking about, looking at it from your side, from the investor side, we've been talking about oncology. You brought up ibrutinib, but if you think about this, more broadly. You're meeting with companies, you're meeting with early stage companies. The science is strong, or you presumably won't stay at the table. But given what we've been talking about and what you said before, which is science sells early, are there companies, are you starting, give us a little color around that. I don't know if you want to, without naming names, but just one or two, maybe anonymous examples you can think of where you or you're aware of a group that have really, either not invested or where this issue was really a significant factor in the valuation.
A bit ago, I think it was you who mentioned that the VCs wanted to get in and get out before this problem occurred. And in fact, I guess probably, 3 to 5 years ago, a pretty good strategy was to short the launch because we consistently saw launches not hitting expectations. I think now we're valuing the science, but I think as there's a kind of a one-to-one correlation as the science progresses, the market access strategy has to progress along with it. So that right at the beginning, when the science is really hot and really cool and all that kind of stuff, maybe there's less focus on market access. But as we get to kind of proof of principle and we start to move into the clinic and go further along in the clinic, we think that the market access strategy has to follow along. And I think what Jeff said, we see a lot of, which is a lot of lip service, but nothing yet that's really detailed and aggressive in terms of figuring out what market access is. I mentioned before, we know how to do it on the science. We call all the key opinion leaders. We know what's going on. On this side of it, I think we're still learning how to do diligence it. And what we see more often than not is the lip service part of market access strategy.
But increasingly, Dennis, you may be willing. I'm sort of interpreting. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you might want to put this burden on the company itself. On the newco, on the company itself, to be able to address that risk in the same way that you put the burden on them to come up with a plan to de-risk the science. Is that a reasonable statement?
Sure, absolutely. Yep. I mean, the burden's on the company for everything else. I mean, the financing burden, the scientific burden, what the competitive landscape looks like. We get a roadmap on some of the other issues that we do diligence on. We expect the company to give us a roadmap on the market access strategy.
Great. I'm going to move us into a completely different area, and it's an area that it represents great excitement, most importantly for patients, but also I'll say for us, for our firm, where our advanced therapeutics practice has now jumped to about a third of our overall business. And we define advanced therapeutics as somewhat the way the FDA is, and basically it's easily defined by what it's not. These are not conventional therapeutics that are off the shelf. So these are cell therapies, normally autologous products that look more like services than they do. They are in vivo and ex vivo gene therapies. Before we blink, it'll probably be gene editing approaches are already in the clinic, and will move forward probably reasonably quickly. I don't have the slide to share with you today, but in one of our presentations, it actually lines up all the programs that are going to be launched within the advanced therapeutics space over the course of the next 5 years, and it's pretty impressive. Finally, a really interesting news flash was that I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, the incoming CEO from the Novartis side of Avexis, which is the gene therapy company that Novartis acquired for $8.7 billion, threw out a trial balloon and said, we think the therapy will justify a price of $4 million. That's their gene therapy for SMA. It is a dramatic breakthrough. Anybody who has ever seen the videos or the pictures of the kids, has great hope for. If you didn't have great hope for science and what we're doing, it gets you right there. It is absolutely remarkable. But I think it was it's probably, I don't want to debate whether it's a responsible thing or not to be doing that. I think clearly Novartis is blazing a very important trail. To their credit, they've done this with Kymriah. Kite is out there with Yescarta or now Gilead. But as we look into this world of advanced therapeutics, we look at one-and-done therapeutics, and we talk about that within the world of access challenges. Okay, because remember, we're talking about access. I'm going to throw this open to everybody. What do we think about the way that world is going to look 5 years from now, when we get through the launch of the next 6 programs?
So I'll start. This is a fundamental, sort of freight train coming, right? And I think the macro challenge here is that all of that incredible technology and science is going to be thrust into a world that is fundamentally not set up to reimburse for it. So it's not the way reimbursement has ever been set up, sort of one and done. So I think the system at some point is going to have to come together and figure out a way to pay for these one and done therapies. Right now, you've got, migration of lives through health plans that, are on average, 24 to 36 months within a particular plan. So Aetna doesn't want to pay $4 million for a one and done gene therapy that's going to be sitting at Cigna 24 months from now. So the system itself today is just simply not set up for that. Never mind sort of self-insured employers and others that might have 2 of these kids that need a $4 million therapy and will literally break the bank. So there are just fundamental challenges that need to be solved, for not least of which is the pricing issue of what is that worth over time, and should all of those be priced at $4 million. There are some efforts being made to address those issues. So, for example, our chief clinical officer at Real Endpoints is working as an advisor to the MIT project. It's a project coming out of MIT called New Digs, and it's called Focus, which is really looking at financing for cures and what are the different ways that the system could potentially do that. And it actually is a collaborative effort around payers. So could payers come together and manage lives collectively to deal with the migration of lives from one to the other? Can there be an annuity? Are there different payment models to address this? And that's where we're going to have to go with this. And I would actually say to the conversation we're having today that it actually behooves the industry to think about what those models could be and help find solutions versus just say, we're going to put this out at $4 million and then throw it over to the payers and say, you're going to have to pay this.
Right.
I don't know, Roger.
Well, Jeff, I just want to, I'm going to give this all back to Roger probably, and Dennis, if you want to comment. I hear you, and you presented that very eloquently. The system's not set up, but I'm a developer, and the FDA under the unmet designation has just given me the very good news that I'm going to be on the market in 2 years. So are you telling me I have to fix the system? Or what's going to happen as this collides? Okay, that's to me is a very, very important question, because we're hearing, yeah, the system's not set up, but we're still going to launch these products into the system. So what do you think, and what do my panelists think the outcome here is going to be?
I'll just say one more thing and turn it over to Roger. Is again, what I was trying to say at the beginning when we talked about some of those disruptive factors, and you talk about this consolidation and these behemoths that are vertically integrating, they're all coming together, having a dialogue on how to solve these problems, how to integrate care better, and yet we still have the pharmaceutical industry still on the outside of that ecosystem. We talk about sort of window dressing and arm's length negotiations. One of the things that I was most surprised at when I transitioned out of pharma after 12 years into what I thought was a partnered company in Walgreens, which is literally delivering 1 in every 4 prescriptions in the United States, which, by the way, is fairly uninspired. For all the cool science we're talking about, at the end of the day, 50% of these prescriptions are being distributed through either CVS or Walgreens by a pharmacy tech that's living at or below the poverty level, and also ringing up your People magazine and your beef jerky and everything else. They're giving you this incredibly scientific, drug. But I think that the challenge that we're seeing, though, is that pharma is still outside of that system. So all of the PBMs are now working with the payers. There's not going to be an incentive to disrupt the system as we know it, right? So everybody's been talking about disrupting the PBMs and their middlemen that add no value. Since I was a lawyer negotiating with PBMs in 1998 at Sharon Powell, we sit here in 2018, and the PBMs, if anything, have gotten more consolidated and stronger, and now have integrated with retail pharmacy chains and payers in a way that there is no incentive for disruption of the system. So, again, it feels like pharma is on the outside looking in of the rest of the system that is trying to solve for some of these challenges.
Thanks. Roger, Dennis, do you want to add anything on the sort of the whole advanced therapeutics, cell and gene therapy environment?
Sure. First of all, Jeff is right. There is this quality of outside looking in. But I also think that it's important to try to think about what you can do, what one of these, what did you call it, advanced therapeutics companies can do tactically to help themselves. And the first thing is that there are now groups of insurance companies which are trying to wrestle with this. Jeff mentioned our Chief Clinical Officer, Jane Barlow, and the work that she's doing with the MIT group. The MIT group includes a number of payers, and they are trying to figure out how to create a consortium for risk sharing. How can they pool their populations so that if Harvard Pilgrim has to pay the initial fee and the drug doesn't work, it's possible that Harvard and a patient has moved on to a different insurer by that point. Harvard Pilgrim can be recompensed for that expenditure, and or among that group, there is a sharing of those high-cost patients. By the same token, it seems that there are also some efforts, and could be some very specific efforts, with reinsurers. And this should be in part driven by the specific biotech and conversations with these kinds of reinsurers as part of the entire commercial development. So if you see at the same time, and we have now certain employers kind of redlining specific drugs that are not necessarily falling into an essential health benefit category. What do you do about that? Well, some of these gene therapies and cell therapies are going to fall into that category. Some of them are going to be redlined by by employers, and so what's going to be necessary is for a biotech company to bring in, as part of its economic package, a reinsurer as part of its entire market access strategy. So there are things that you can do. It's just going to require a different kind of skill set that than most biotechs, let alone pharmas, actually have.
Okay, thanks. What I'm gonna do is take two questions here. There are quite a few questions. Many of the questions are quite similar, so I'm going to sort of wrap them up in one or two. And then I'm going to ask the panelists for any sort of parting thoughts here before we wrap up. We've got about 5 minutes. So one more specific question, which is intriguing, I think, is that, following the approval of Spinraza, are payers still open for real neuroregenerative treatments, okay, outside of gene therapy, come back to the conventional pharmaceutical world? Is there an appetite, for instance, to pay for biological, classic sort of NCE-derived therapies before we get the disruption from CRISPR-Cas9 and gene therapy approaches? I think what this question is essentially saying is maybe those approaches are going to be preferable to a drug like Spinraza, which costs, I think, $750,000 a year, for probably forever. So what's the appetite there? And then maybe in the same spirit, but much more general, I'm gonna combine these in the issue of time. Is that assuming there is, and these are for rare diseases, what data do rare disease drugs need to do broadly to generate market access? We haven't spent a lot of time specifically focusing on rare diseases, and in point of fact, many of the drugs we put up there listed for suboptimal launches were not actually rare disease drugs. So to come back to this, let's do the first question first, which is the rather specific question, and then just go about rare diseases more broadly, and we'll probably finish there. Roger, do you have any thoughts? I don't know. We didn't look at this before. Any thoughts on Spinraza? One of the things that's interested us is what's going to be the interaction and how Spinraza, from a payer point of view, how does a payer view Spinraza versus perhaps viewing AVX-101, which is the Novartis Avexis AAV9 gene therapy, both of which are going to be indicated, will be indicated for SMA. Any thought there?
Yeah, so we could have easily included Spinraza in the suboptimal launch list if we had wanted to, just because it took so long longer than anybody expected for payers to start paying for that. They really delayed on that. And payers will, of course, be, they have not been happy with the pricing of that drug and will be looking for alternatives. With the Avexis program, again, it's going to be an issue of how well they prepare the market and prepare all of those issues that Jeff has been talking about in terms of a market access strategy. But if they're going to come out, they've sent this trial balloon, this $4 million trial balloon up to say, this could be worth so much. And then when they come out at $1 million, it's going to look like a 75% discount. That's whether or not how they will handle that, I don't know. And frankly, how Biogen is going to handle Spinraza, I don't know. But there is fundamentally no reason that that Biogen wouldn't begin to recognize exactly the issue of unmet need that we talked about before, payer-defined unmet need. What drugs can be substituted for it, and react to that. So it's very possible that we could see a significant, for example, price decrease with Spinraza. I can't imagine actually Biogen liking that idea, but certainly it's possible. And by the same token, I have no idea what Novartis is going to do, or I don't even know who at Novartis is going to be doing that. It might be the Avexis folks. But it would be interesting to me to hear what those discussions are within that company about how about the kind of approach to these issues that they're going to be facing. So the answer is, I guess I don't know, Ed, but it sure does seem to me appropriate to think about this in the traditional ways we think about unmet need.
Let me close by offering each of the panelists just a chance to any parting ideas, but maybe make it within the context of this. So, we talked earlier about oncology being, a bit of a safe harbor, but it will be the next area. The other ones has been rare disease, right? I mean, and Roger just mentioned it. Spinraza might have been able to put up there as one of the suboptimal launches. So, in giving the comments, we're looking forward, all right? And Dennis, particularly to bring you back here, so much of the VC world has been focused for the last, 5+ years, maybe more, on rare disease, and rare disease nucos and rare disease startups, because it has been incredibly appealing, not only because of the relatively rapid path to market, but the relatively lower risk, and obviously the very high pricing. What's your thinking around access and how this is going to shake out in the rare disease world? Because that incorporates both the advanced therapeutics and conventional drugs. Dennis, do you want to take a first stab at that?
Yeah, as you said, there's been so much work that we've done in oncology and the rare disease area that's been a ripe area for investment. And as Jeff mentioned, if oncology is going to be the next one to go, we still haven't seen much pushback on the orphan or rare disease area. So I think right now those two areas still remain attractive. Although certainly the oncology space is way too crowded, and as with you said, thinly differentiated drugs. But on the orphan drug side, we haven't seen any pushback yet.
You want to talk about that, Jeff? Tell us when that might be.
No, I think that's right, but I think it's quite specific, right? So what the payer side is doing is they're actually identifying exactly who they have in their plan and understanding what that's going to cost them, right? I mean, so again, I sort of come back to this issue of where pharma is fitting in with the ecosystem, so to take it out even more broadly. Again, the biotechs and the VCs are still solving for problems that maybe the payers are not. It's very unusual for a pharma company to go and meet with United or Aetna or Anthem and say, what are your big issues? What are you solving for, right? Even though they're defining the unmet need, we still have this, everybody going after the rare and orphan diseases because they believe they can solve a very specific problem, charge whatever they want, and go to the payers and do that. To Dennis's point, I think there is still a level of flexibility there, but I think, and again, what the payer side will do is just go right through their data and try to figure out how many people this impacts and what it's going to cost them. As they do, I think, one of the more controversial things I say about these kinds of things is particularly in global companies where people are flying all over the world either to look at clinical trials or visit sites or do business reviews, is that people are willing to do that and get on a plane and go to the Czech Republic and do a business review or look at a clinical trial site, but people don't get on a plane and go to Eden Prairie, Minneapolis to meet with United or Louisville, Kentucky to meet with Humana, even though the level of sales and impact on their businesses far outweighs anything that's happening in a particular site or in the Czech Republic. So again, sort of back to thinking about that ecosystem and how you can have more of a conversation versus turning a blind eye to what you're trying to solve for.
All the hotels in Prague just got very mad at you, but so Roger, any closing comments before we wrap up?
No, I think Jeff's right. I will let him have the last words.
Okay. Well, I think he just did, and we are slightly over in time. So I'm going to take this opportunity to just thank the panelists here, to thank our great collaborators at Real Endpoints, to thank Dennis Purcell for his time and great contributions today, and letting us in on what is really going on out there in the VC world in terms of this issue being such an important issue in terms of the valuation of early stage companies. So with that, I also want to say that we have all the questions here. I apologize if we couldn't get to all of them. I did try to weave in questions into the discussion and went liberally off the guide we had created. So you may have heard some of your questions addressed. If you haven't, and we can decipher your question, we will promise you an email response and even an invitation to a dialogue if you'd like to follow up. So with that, thank you very much, and thank you again for your time and for attending. Look forward to speaking to you again soon. Bye.